Welcome to Facing the Future, brought to you by the Concord Coalition on WKXL, New Hampshire's talk radio station. I'm your host, Bob Bixby. Each week, we take a nonpartisan dive into topics related to the federal budget, the economy, and how it all affects our nation's future. This week, we'll talk with two members of Congress who are working together across party lines on legislation to improve the nation's fiscal outlook. They are Representatives Scott Peters, Democrat of California, and Bill Huizenga, Republican of Michigan. They are co-chairs of the Bipartisan Fiscal Forum, which is a group of congressional members dedicated to sounding the alarm about our nation's unsustainable debt trajectory and working together to get control of our fiscal future. And that sounds something like the agenda of the Concord Coalition. So Representatives Peters and Huizenga have co-sponsored two pieces of legislation that we're going to talk about today. One would create a bipartisan fiscal commission to improve the nation's fiscal outlook, which certainly needs improvement. And the other, called No Budget, No Pay, would dock the pay of members of Congress for not doing their budget and appropriations bills on time. Congressman Peters represents California's 50th congressional district, and Congressman Huizenga represents Michigan's 4th congressional district. And they both claim to have the most beautiful district in the country, and I think they're both right. And both were also Concord Coalition Economic Patriot honorees in 2023 for their bipartisan work together on fiscal responsibility. Concord Coalition Executive Director Carolyn Bordeaux, who also had a beautiful congressional district when she served in Congress, joins the conversation. Everyone, welcome to Facing the Future. You know, we talk a lot about gloom and doom on this show and dire projections of the future if the fiscal trajectory doesn't change, and we certainly won't disappoint today. But I did want to start just emphasizing some good news. We do have a government shutdown. There's a lot of partisan division in Washington, but we have with us today two members of Congress who are working together on a bipartisan basis on what are normally contentious issues. And they are contentious issues. But so before we get into specific legislation that you've been working on, I wanted to get your, well, I just wanted to get your opinion on what motivated you guys to work together on long-term fiscal issues. Let me start with Mr. Huizenga.
Sure. Well, and Bob, really good to be with you, and Carolyn and Scott as well. We've had an opportunity now over a number of years to sit and have these types of conversations. Not enough of those kinds of conversations are happening, probably, frankly, across society, not just within government. You're asking though about sort of the origins of this. For me personally, has always been a concern and an issue. I ran for the U.S. House in 2010. One of the main issues, at least in our Republican primary at that time, was the debt and deficit. It seems quaint, frankly, compared to where we are today, but it's always been something that's been a driver in my involvement and my motivation with what's going on. And in my previous career, before coming into the U.S. House, I was in the state legislature in Michigan. Excuse me, in Michigan. Prior to that, I was the district director for my predecessor, a guy named Peter Hoekstra, who is now our ambassador to Canada. Pete served on the budget committee when John Kasich was the chairman of that. I was in Washington, D.C. with Pete and a guy named Mark Newman, who's probably a name that might be familiar with some folks back in the late 90s, where they were doing the calculations and they were thinking that they were going to reach balance in the federal government's budget, and it turned out it ended up being true, and that was a good lesson for me. When I got to the state legislature, I had to deal with a balanced budget requirement within the Michigan Constitution. Got here to Washington, D.C., and we had none like that. I helped start something called the Balanced Budget Amendment Caucus, It was a bipartisan group at the time that was saying, you know what, we need to look at putting a balanced budget amendment into the U.S. Constitution. That had been attempted back in the 90s. I believe that was 95, if I'm correctly remembering correctly, 95, 96, somewhere in there. There had been a vote on that. Did not reach the 2/3 mark, but it's always been basically a motivator for me. We've seen groups like the problem solvers, which I only half jokingly say are trying to solve every problem, right? It's everything from healthcare to road funding, to probably peace in the Middle East. Some of those things apparently are more achievable than others, but yeah, this notion of really focusing in on our debt and our deficit started with kind of personal conversations. A guy, Jody Arrington, who's the chairman of our budget committee now, he and I had talked, and we talked about trying to get together with a group of like-minded people. We knew we had to be bipartisan. Eventually, we did have a group that came together. We very unoriginally called ourselves the 30 by 30 group. That was because it was 30 Democrats and 30 Republicans. We've always had this notion that it needed to be sort of Noah Ark style, 2 by 2. We didn't want to have it imbalanced with one party or the other. And then when Jody became the chairman of the budget committee, he felt he couldn't continue on with that chairmanship along with Scott because of his work on the committee, and he asked me to step in, and that's sort of been the origins for me of kind of where I've gotten involved with by the way, our bipartisan fiscal forum, BFF. We chose that on purpose.
Yeah.
I was wondering that when I saw BFF. Congressman Peters, what's your motivation for getting involved in this?
So I just I came from local government. We couldn't. I was the city council president in San Diego. We couldn't do this kind of thing either. So when I got to Congress, what really stunned me was a couple things. One is the the amount of debt we're taking on was starting to generate interest payments that were the biggest part of our budget. We Democrats, we claim to be the party that wants to make government work, and we are really crippling ourselves when interest payments on stuff we've done before start to be a current obligation against competing with the other things we need to do. And so I think it's generational theft, and it's really taking it's my generation really robbing my kids and my grandkids of the kind of prosperity and world leadership that we've come to take for granted from the United States. The other thing is that this is one of the products of the dysfunction in Congress where we're not talking to each other. So I think we realized with Jody and now Bill that this is something that can only be solved in a bipartisan way. Democrats are going to have to deal with spending cuts, and Republicans are going to have to deal with tax increases. And I think every American understands that, and I think they accept that. And I think that nothing would make most people happier than us coming out with an agreement about how to do that. So I'm committed to doing it. I also just parenthetically have my eyes on Social Security right now, which is on its deathbed. We know that in not very many years, 6, 8, 10 years, when revenues are no longer able to meet expenses, that we'll have across the board cuts. I think they would be something like 21% right now, whether you're 92 or 72, whether you're rich or poor. And it just seems to me like we could do better. And so I appreciate people like Bill. We're sort of standing up against opposition on the fringes of both of our, not even the fringes of both of our parties, but people on the Democratic side who say, don't touch my Social Security, even though are watching it die. And then people like Grover Norquist or Newt Gingrich who said no to any tax increase at all, no matter what. We have to be in the middle. We're going to have to talk back to those people if we're going to be responsible about this nation's budget and about our future. because it really does affect it affects the stability of the dollar, our economic leadership, but it will also affect our national security if we don't have the strength to respond to crises, whether it's something like a pandemic or something like an attack. We're really weakening ourselves, and I think Bill and I understand that. I think more people than are in our group in Congress understand it. We just have to have the guts to say so and to come up with a plan.
We're going to have to take our first break, but for those listening on the radio and the podcast, let the record reflect that Mr. Huizenga was nodding his head yes in agreement to when Representative Peters was talking about having to get to work on Social Security, which is something we might want to talk about a little bit later in the show as well. We're going to take our first break. You're listening to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby. Concord Coalition Executive Director Carolyn Bordeaux and I are talking with Representative Scott Peters, Democrat of California, and Representative Bill Huizenga, Republican of Michigan. We'll be right back after these short messages. Welcome back to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby, and I'm talking with, I'm joined by Carolyn Bordeaux, Executive Director of the Concord Coalition, and I'm talking with Representative Scott Peters, Democrat of California, and Representative Bill Huizenga, Republican of Michigan. Carolyn, I managed to hog all of the questions in the first section, so let me turn to you.
All right. Well, first, I just want to say thank you to Representative Peters and Huizenga for being on the show. And I also just want to flag for everybody listening how unusual it is, how important this is that we have people from both parties talking to each other. And I just really, really appreciate that you guys are willing to work across the aisle. One question that we ask a lot of our guests these days, because, Congress, really is doing one thing after the next with not much attention to trying to close the deficit. So what happens in your mind? What do you see happening if we just continue on this path and don't take any constructive action to try to close our, roughly $2 trillion gap between our revenues and expenditures? And I guess this time we can start with you.
Start with Scott.
Start with Scott. Yeah.
Thanks, Carolyn. By the way, it's nice to see you again. I miss having you in Congress too, where you were a faithful member of our merry band. So I'm concerned about a couple things. As I mentioned, we take for granted the primacy of the dollar as the worldwide currency. And what we do by mounting up this debt is we really put that at risk. And that's the kind of thing that maybe like a heart attack, it may come up suddenly on us and may be difficult to deal with before it's too late. I guess the other thing I would say is that, as I mentioned before, this money's not going to get any cheaper. Other countries are going to be borrowing more money, partly because, for instance, we're asking Europe to build up its own defense capabilities. Other countries are developing, and interest rates are going to be going higher. And again, that exposes our taxpayers to more obligations, but also crowds out the kind of investment on the private side and the public side that we want. And I think really limits our kids' opportunities. And I would just say, finally, emphasize that, Bill and I each probably disagree on big bills that Democrats and Republicans have faced. But that's not even the biggest thing. The biggest thing is that every year we're borrowing, as you said, $2 trillion just to pay our expenses. So the debt goes from 34 to 36 to 38 to 40 to 42 every year, and we're not really taking account of that. We're arguing a lot about the big beautiful bill or the bailout for COVID. But what really concerns me is that we've got a complete lack of discipline around appropriations, and it's on both parties now, because we're all we'd rather as a body avoid the pain than make the right decisions, and that's what really concerns me, because there's a dysfunction in government that in itself is harmful to us.
Bill, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I want to pick up, look, weeding the garden is very difficult. And our process of weeding the garden is our appropriations process, or it should be. And it's broken, it's dysfunctional. The 15 years that I've been here, I'm in my 8th term now. I've never gone through the entire process of a budget, then having 12 appropriations bills. And this maybe leads into one of our other topics that we can talk about if we're not able to pass a budget, which I think Scott and I would both argue is probably one of the most basic functions of what we're supposed to be doing, and if we're not doing our job, then why in the world are we getting paid? But let's leave that for right now, and still talk about some of the consequences. I sit on the Financial Services Committee. I'm the vice chair of that committee. And we deal a lot with the Fed. We deal a lot with interest rates. We deal a lot with what's happening in the general economy. And I think there was a window that was missed where we saw ultra low, and I would argue maybe artificially low interest that had been introduced into society. We never locked in our long-term debt on that. And instead, we did all of this short-term funding. Why? Because it was still even lower than the long-term. And how in the world are we going to pay $38 trillion off if we're gonna be subject to some of those same interest rate bubbles that may be rising and falling? That's an issue. If we aren't able to control ourselves on the fiscal side, that just leaks over into virtually everything, and it's squeezing out whether it's the Department of Defense, Department of War, whatever you want to call it, or domestic issues, or whether it's transportation issues. When we have to come up with more and more money for the interest on the debt, that means there's less and fewer dollars unless we borrow it to then pay for some of these other things. And one slight correction on Scott from the previous, I think it was the previous section talking about Social Security. The Social Security Trust Fund folks and the Medicaid Trust Fund have both come out with a report estimating when they're going to have their problems, and it doesn't get better, right? I want to make sure I've got the years right. But for Medicare funding, the funding will be depleted by 2033. And that means an 11% cut to Medicare payments. Social Security funding is expected to be depleted by 2034. So we're within a 10-year window, and that's going to result in their estimation a 23% cut to Social Security. That means people that are in the system now or entering the system now are going to see nearly a quarter of their Social Security payment disappear. And those kind of consequences are just huge. So what does the future look like? We're going to have this interest monster that's going to continue to grow and grow and grow, consume a larger and larger percentage of our entire spending. By the way, about 75% of all of the federal government spending, Scott and I will never vote on it. And not because we don't want to, but because it's outside the system. It's on this autopilot, and the House, the Senate, none of us deal with it. The president doesn't sign a bill authorizing it. It's just kind of outside any parameters that we have. And so we're going to have to wrestle that one to the ground too.
So that is a great segue into some of the legislation that you guys have introduced together in a bipartisan fashion. And one of the reasons I think it's so important. So we'll start with the Fiscal Commission Act, which does take on all of these different parts. Maybe, I guess we can go to you, Bill. Can you give us a little overview of what this legislation does? And what's really important is we often get a lot of questions, why are you going to study this issue again? Why is this something more than just another study of the problem?
And we've got about 2 minutes before we need to take the break.
Yeah, well, I'll go quick. Basically, in my mind, and I'll let Scott speak for himself, but this is desperation time, right? I mean, we've got to do something here, and we clearly have demonstrated that we don't have the discipline to go through that appropriations process and the fiscal side of things the way it should be working. And by the way, the House is the bearer of the purse strings constitutionally, and so I have come to the conclusion that our best step forward is to have this type of commission, not to just study, Carolyn, but to actually propose. And it would be all four corners, bipartisan, bicameral, meaning the speaker, the minority leader in both the House and the Senate, the majority leader in the Senate, are all going to be able to choose 3 members of Congress plus 1 outside expert that would come together. We want to try to put a time frame on it to then come up with a series of recommendations, and then to have those recommendations get an up or down vote. No modifiers, no amendments, no changes. Like, let's just get the cards on the table and say, yes, this is something we need to do, or no, it's not. And we had to kind of go through some machinations on the Senate side they operate under very different rules about making it an up or down vote. But that, in a nutshell, is really the idea behind it. I don't know if Scott has anything in the remaining seconds he can add to it.
I'll just
Well,
say,
we can let Scott go for as long as he wants on the other side of the break. Why don't we do that?
There we go, Bob. There, you're wrangling us. That's good.
Yeah.
That's good.
We'll take the break now. You're listening to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby. Concord Coalition Executive Director Carolyn Bourdeau and I are talking with the co-chairs of the Congressional Bipartisan Fiscal Forum, the BFFs, Representative Scott Peters of California, Democrat of California, and Bill Huizenga, Republican of Michigan. We'll be right back after these short messages. Welcome back to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby. Concord Coalition Executive Director Carolyn Bourdeau and I are talking with co-chairs of the Bipartisan Fiscal Forum in Congress. They are Representative Scott Peters of California and Bill Huizenga, Republican of Michigan. We're talking about a bill that they have co-sponsored, which would create a new bipartisan fiscal commission. And Representative Peters, let's go to you for your take on this bill. Why is it so important?
well, I actually thought Bill did a really good job of explaining kind of how the bill works. I would just say, one of the criticisms we sometimes get is the Congress should do this, and we don't need a commission. We should do this in Congress. Clearly, that's correct. We should do it in Congress, but I think it's clear to Bill and me, to a lot of us, that it's just not happening. And what we need is a process that's going to force us to deal with the facts, force us to be bipartisan, and force us to put a bill on the floor of the House and the Senate for an up or down vote. And that's why we're pursuing this, and we hope we'll get some more support. And for your listeners, to the extent that they can reach out to people who represent them, and if they think it's a good idea, they could let them know that would help us develop the support we need to get this across the finish line.
We particularly need it in the Senate too. So everybody listening to this, please reach out to your senators. We'd like to see something similar introduced in the Senate side as well.
It's very interesting that you mentioned that, because one thing about this commission bill that distinguishes it from others is that it specifically incorporates a public education campaign. I mean, it says that the commission will to do a public education campaign. So this is a jump ball, whichever or both of you to say, but for me, who's been in this, public education about fiscal issues for 30 some years, that was a really key part of this, to bring the public along with whatever the commission was doing. So I'll let you describe, how did that get into the bill, and what is your hope for the public education component?
Well, I just think we heard from folks who worked on the Simpson-Bowles process about how important that was to getting support in Congress. So it's hard to vote for things that your constituents hate. It's still hard to do it when they hate them, but if they understand a little bit more about them, it's helpful to you. I suspect that in a dark room, that with a few experts, that Bill and Carolyn and I could come up with the right plan, But if you do it in a dark room, it's not going to have a lot of trust. So the idea was to engage the public as much as we could along the way so that they understood what we were doing. They understood the hard choices we had to make. They saw both sides of the issue, and that when we did take that hard vote, they would be with us more than they're against us.
Yeah,
Now,
I
there's
think
an interesting component here also about the voting. There are 16 members of the commission, 12 of them are members of Congress, 4 of them are outside experts. The outside experts don't get a vote in the final thing. But I think the interesting thing is, in order to have a majority recommendation, you need to have at least 2 members of the opposite party. Is that, do I have that correct? So,
yes, yeah,
Yes,
that
yes.
yeah, and really the idea is that we aren't going to be able to do this with one party or one institution, House or Senate, alone. And some might ask, well, what's the president's role? Well, we want the president, whoever that person may be, to have good faith input into this. But it's really constitutionally, this lies with elected officials. And that's one of the reasons why we don't have these outside experts who are would be part of the commission, not being necessarily voting on that, because ultimately it takes us that are duly elected representatives of the people to say yay or nay as we would be moving forward. And by the way, we're the ones that also hold the consequences for those votes. And look, at the end of the day, if we are so far out ahead of the American people, this will go nowhere. Nor, though, can we be lagging behind the American people or reality, frankly. And we've got to somehow marry those two things up. And that means education. Then, we don't have a Ross Perot buying national television time right now to talk about the debt and deficit and having his charts that he's holding up. But we've got to come up with some type of educational program like that is just going to raise the bar. And I know Carolyn and the Concord Coalition put on those programs. There's others that have put on those programs. It's been fascinating to me, having been involved in this process going back to the late 80s, where I really became involved in volunteering, and then was a political science major and lived through a number of those presidential elections as volunteering, working on those, and now as an elected official. This alarm has been rung many, many times, but the intensity of the problem has just grown, because we are just seeing again this debt monster that is just continually growing, gobbling up more and more of our resources. Still hasn't been addressed, at least not sufficiently that we're able to sit back and say, took care of that one.
Carolyn.
Well, we have a lot to do on that front, and I was watching a TV show where George Will was talking to an audience, and he said, it was back in the early 2000s, and he said, gosh, someday our payments on interest may be greater than national defense. And the audience gasped, and here we are. And it just is not having the impact that people think. But I think something like this, if you can elevate this issue through this commission, that will help just, it will help bring attention to it. It'll help that education piece really, really get some legs. So I think that is very important. So turning our attention, though, to another wonderful bill that you guys just introduced together, the No Budget, No Pay Act. And so would love to have you guys talk about this a bit. And thought I'd start with you, Scott, since you have some good experience with this in California, and can talk about
Right.
why you introduced this bill, and
Yeah.
Does it work?
I mean, I know Bill loves taking examples from California, but here's one that actually worked.
Well,
So-
plenty of examples. Most of them don't work, but yeah.
Well, I'm just saying,
Every once in a while they do.
we'll build our lists. Here's my list. This one goes on my list. So California had this thing where every year they were late on the budget, and they enacted this rule in 2010. They're always late, chronically late. And the first year that they enacted this no budget, no pay rule, I think they were over like 3 days, and then everyone realized, oh my gosh, I'm not getting paid. And they passed their budget, and they were never late again because they had skin in the game. It's as obvious as anything. If we were right now not getting paid, all the Republicans would be clamoring for Speaker Johnson to bring us back. All the Democrats would be clamoring for Chuck Schumer to make a deal, and because we had skin in the game. And I think people are really nervous about missing their paychecks. A lot of people in Congress are not wealthy. They have two homes to pay for and a family and everything else. But that's the point. So do TSA people. So do air traffic controllers. So do the troops when they don't get paid. And so we ought to be in the same boat with the American people. I think it's obvious that not only is that the right thing to do, but it will also be effective in helping us get our work done. It would provide the right incentive for us. And it worked in California beautifully, and no one's lost a paycheck since that first year.
That's great
Oh,
news. Bill,
think
what brought you to this bill?
Yeah,
this meeting?
lighting a fire under the process is necessary here. And look, I was in the state legislature when it was Governor Granholm at the time, and we had our first government shutdown ever. And that was sort of my first lesson in how we slide into these things. Rick Snyder got elected, and he in Michigan after I was done serving in the state legislature, but that he said that is his primary goal. This is the first thing they were going to do. And the fiscal year ending at the end of September, they were never later than June 15 with the budget in Michigan for his 8 years that he was governor. Unfortunately, we just saw this happen again, where this time it was a technical shutdown, but it was right at the brink. The state legislature and Governor Whitmer didn't come to an agreement until the wee morning hours of October 1st. And there was a lot of discussion about, are they going to be having this again? And to me, this is it's a real visceral way of sharpening everyone's focus on this. And I think Scott hit the nail on the head. How do we look at those TSA agents and air traffic controllers, the Coast Guard folks, those that are Department of Agriculture that are having to deal with WIC and the WIC programs themselves and those kinds of things that are faltering, not to mention our men and women who are in uniform, who are literally on the front lines. How do they basically get told, hey, appreciate you showing up. We'll probably pay you in a month or so. Oh, by the way, if this drags on more than a month, we'll get around to it. And we're sitting here constitutionally guaranteed our salaries. We think this is a constitutional way of addressing that, forcing us to feel some of that same pain and that same heat that everybody else is.
We're going to have to take our last break here. You're listening to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby. Concord Coalition Executive Director Carolyn Bordeaux and I are talking with Representative Scott Peters, Democrat of California, and Bill Huizenga, Republican of Michigan, and they are co-chairs of the Bipartisan Fiscal Forum. We'll be right back after these short messages. Welcome back to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby. Concord Coalition Executive Director Carolyn Bordeaux and I are talking with Congressman Scott Peters, Democrat of California, and Bill Huizenga, Republican of Michigan. They are co-chairmen of the Bipartisan Fiscal Forum. And we're talking about some bills that they have introduced together. One of them is called the No Budget, No Pay Act, which seems to be very timely at the moment. Because there is no budget, but there is congressional pay. Although I think both of you have taken steps to give it back or give it to somebody else while the government is shut down. So anyway, on this No Budget, No Pay Act, I have heard it said that may be unconstitutional to deprive members of Congress their pay. And I think you were cognizant of that when you were drafting the bill. So what is the constitutionality of no budget, no pay? Because the Constitution, there is a provision that says that the varying the compensation of the services of members cannot be done until an election of
yeah, without an
representatives.
intervening election. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the 27th Amendment that says that, and what it's trying to do, and I think what it was mainly envisioned to do, is to stop members of Congress from getting elected, jacking up their pay, giving themselves a big pay raise before the next election. So probably didn't have it really envisioning that they would be reducing our pay or withholding our pay, but the rule still holds. Obviously, the law still holds. So we have to have an intervening election before this could take place. But this has never been challenged, and so there is a bit of a question that's there. We tried to structure it in a way, though, that answered many of those legal questions. And again, to the point where we've got a primary job here, which is, and by the way, we have to distinguish, Bob, and I know Carolyn and Scott know this well, but when we say we have to pass a budget, that's really just the framework of what our spending is. Then there's 12 appropriations bills that fund all of that that spending, that federal government spending. And so we kind of shortened it down. It's just we can't come up with an acronym for no budget and no 12 appropriations bills and no pay. It just doesn't sound quite as snappy, right? But that really is the idea, is we're going to have this process that of setting the parameters of our spending, then going through and actually laying out within the various departments what those spending priorities will be. As the analogy I used earlier in the show is, that's going to allow us to weed the garden. That's to figure out what's working, what's not working, do more of the stuff that's working, hopefully. Let's pull those weeds that aren't working, or maybe at one time were appropriate and have now changed. And to me, it makes some sense.
And this applies to both, right? I mean, they would have to do the budget on time, which comes earlier in the year, which is, the deadline is supposed to be April 15th, I believe, to do the budget resolution. And then the appropriations bills by the end of the fiscal year, which is September 30th.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and what I always say to folks, because we also have another step in there where legally the president is supposed to propose their budget. What is their spending priorities? And I always say, by law, the president proposes it, and by custom, Congress ignores it. Then we move on to our own process. And this goes back to the 70s and some of the attempted sort of revisions to government spending and how the system was broken even back then. And I'm not convinced that the entire system is set and working for us right now.
You think?
Okay, I'm pretty sure that it's not.
Carolyn?
So what are the prospects for these bills? You've got them, they're introduced, they are bipartisan. This is fantastic. But we've got a lot of bills that have been introduced. How do we get these moving through this very tough legislative process we have for ourselves these days?
I'm gonna take the microphone to defer to Bill, because I think that we made sure he was the lead person on the bill just because Speaker McCarthy was interested in it, but we didn't get across the line then. I would think that a lot of us would sign up for the bills if Speaker Johnson were interested in it, but I don't have any update on that.
So here's the realities of the political world. The majority is who sets the tone, the tenor, and the actual legislative agenda. There is, again, a real attempt to try to keep this as bipartisan as possible. So even on our various bills, we have tried to do this kind of, again, 2 by 2, making sure that we're pairing up a Republican and a Democrat so that it doesn't get lopsided one way or the other. Speaker Johnson, when we had the, shall we say, surprise speaker election back a little over a year ago, without anybody knowing, because he had no speechwriters at that point. They had nobody that was really advising him on it. This was truly his own thoughts. He talked about fiscal responsibility and the need to address it. And so I think at his core, he is interested in it. And I'll let Scott speak for himself, but my experience has been this place can at times take on a life of its own. And when you are seeing the interesting groups on both the right and the left coming out and blasting away, Scott and I might feel like that means we're probably about where we need to be, but it also makes it more difficult for our friends in leadership to allow some of those things to move forward. And so we're continually asking, continually bringing it up, continually using it as a pressure point. The advantage I think we have is the growing number of voices of our colleagues is I think going to make this inevitable. Now, I would prefer to have it be voluntarily inevitable, meaning there's just going to be so much momentum behind it that we do the right thing, or there's going to be something that's going to happen, probably with the economy, that is going to harm millions of Americans, which is going to force us into some sort of action. And that's far less desirable in my mind, I'm sure in Scott's as well. But it's hard ringing the bell when you have people that aren't interested in acknowledging the problem.
Yeah. I would also say,
I was just going to say we got about
too.
3 minutes left here.
Sure, just the political dynamic as well. I'm encouraged by a growing recognition on my side of the aisle that this is an issue. Just a few years ago, we had this ridiculous modern monetary theory, the notion that you could print as much money as you wanted because inflation was over with. That's largely been rejected. You even have economists like Paul Krugman saying, yeah, now the deficit's a size where you have to worry about it, when maybe when it was 4 trillion or 6 trillion, he reasonably thought it wasn't that much of a problem. But I think now there's not a lot of debate that this is a serious challenge for us. No one likes paying this much in interest for things that we paid for years ago, that we did years ago, and are not getting any benefit from today. So I think that if we could get this bill somehow to the floor, I suspect it would pass pretty overwhelmingly. But as Bill noted, that's a windy and cloudy road under any circumstance.
Any last minute thoughts about ending the shutdown?
Yeah, just vote at the Senate would be helpful. I mean, look, this is a tough part of what we have to do, and I'll let Scott have the last word on this one as loyal opposition. But here's one of my main concerns. There's a discussion about permanent, massive changes to policy to the tune of $1.5 trillion that would be done in the confines of a temporary spending bill here to just keep the government open. We need to have in my mind, we need to have the debate. But if this is allowed to happen in this fashion, this is the ultimate give a mouse a cookie moment, because I know what my side's going to do when the shoe's on the other foot, and I would suspect that exact same thing would happen, big, small, whatever. Hey, that's only $500 billion. So you want government to be open? Well, I need X, Y, or Z, and there's serious issues, but I think they have to be dealt with in the context of the circumstances.
Fair enough. I just say that the president can do peace in the Middle East. He's got to figure out how to get 7 Democratic votes, and he has not reached out and tried to have that meeting. And I also think there's just a real lack of trust when typically I've been through 44 CRs, continuing resolutions. They've all been bipartisan. There's never been a take it or leave it deal that's passed. I just want the president to sit down and hear about what it would take to get the 7 votes he needs to reopen the government. That's not too much to ask from the party that's in leadership. And Bill might make a good point, but it's got to be something. and you can't really get anywhere if you just leave the opening offer and you don't come back with anything else. So I think there needs to be talks. I don't think it's productive for us not to be in DC. In other shutdowns, all the members of the House have been talking vigorously about what we could do. That's just not happening. We need the president to show some leadership here and really put America first.
Well, I want to thank you both for that perspective and for working together in the bipartisan fiscal forum on these longer term fiscal issues, which are so vital to the future of the nation. And just to underscore what Carolyn said at the beginning, it's so great to know that there are reasonable folks working together on these difficult problems, even in the middle of the temporary dysfunction over appropriations. You've been listening to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby, and I've been talking with Concord Coalition Executive Director Carolyn Bordeaux and Representative Scott Peters, Democrat of California, and Representative Bill Huizenga, Republican of Michigan. I'll be back next week with another edition of Facing the Future.